Welcome to JCAT, a program that seeks to introduce Japanese, contextualized literature and ideas for use by missionaries and anyone that seeks to share the gospel with Japanese people.
日本人から聞く日本のキリスト教。
Thanks for tuning in. I'm here with Justin Lau, who is a new friend of mine, who I met through another friend. And he grew up in Japan and has since gone on to study theology at Cranmer Hall. He's got a Master's of Arts degree in theology and ministry, as well as a master's degree in English literary studies at Durham University in the UK, where he's currently serving as a worship pastor. Justin, thanks for coming on. If you could just tell us about yourself and some of your background, that'd be great.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan. Yeah, like you mentioned, I grew up in Japan, so I am Singaporean by nationality. My parents are Chinese Singaporean, but they were missionaries to Japan. So I grew up as an MK or missionary kid in Japan for the first 18 years of my life. But I also attended an international school, an American international school, a Christian school that I attended CAJ, Christian Academy in Japan, which is in Tokyo, and I attended that from second grade all the way to 12th grade. And so I have a very mixed background, which is very classic for a third culture kid or a TCK like myself. And after graduating in 2009, I actually went back to Singapore to serve 2 years in the military for my national service. And then I came to the UK to study, and I am still here. And I currently serve as a worship pastor in London.
Great. Yeah. And I think this could be helpful talk for a lot of people in Japan, because many people who are missionaries in Kanto have a pretty close relationship with CAJ. I have a kid there now. We just mentioned off air some of the same teachers even. I work with teachers at CAJ that you went to school with back when you were a student there, that they're teachers now. So I think it's a really central cog in the missionary world here in Tokyo. And so I think that's some really good background. So today we're going to talk about decolonization, which I think is interesting because I feel like there's sort of a spectrum of synonyms or near synonyms that people use. And on one side, it can be much more friendly terminology, and on the other side, it can be more specific, and it can be probably less comfortable. So I kind of put decolonization in the middle somewhere. On one side, I often use decontextualization. I don't think that's a synonym of decolonization, but there's a lot of overlap. And then even further down the line, I think you have where people use deconstruction. And I think, when thought about when I guess if you allow the speaker to define any of those terms, you can come away with really a vibrant expression of Christianity. Even someone that may claim to be a deconstructionist. I guess I just want to say for the listeners, some people may have kind of a gut reaction to a word like deconstruction or decolonial. And I just want to invite people to try to let go of some of any, preconceptions with those words, and we'll try to, I think, define what we're thinking of when we say some of these words in a way that I think is really helpful to the idea of sort of a natural Christianity in any context, and specifically in this context being Japan, and then in your context being I suppose more of a kind of a broadly Asian or mixed Asian, or I can let you sort of define that. But can you tell us a little bit about your uh decolonization journey, or what decolonization means to you, and how you went about some of that?
Yeah, definitely. I think you raise a really vital and important point about the associations people have with certain terminology. People understandably have stigmas or preconceptions based on their experiences. And I just want to say from the outset, I am a Christian. I'm not an ex-Christian. I am a Christian who believes in Jesus and endeavors to follow Jesus day by day for the rest of my life. Like that is still who I am, and I haven't lost my faith. But I remember seeing a tweet by this, I think she's African American woman called Ekemini Uwan. This was a couple years ago, and it said something like, some of you are decolonizing your faith to the point that you're decolonizing your way out of the faith. And that really stuck with me, and what I realized was that there were a lot of people, a lot of my friends as well, my peers, had gone through a deconstructing almost of their faith, partly because of negative experiences that they had in relation to Christians or churches. But then they were actually losing their faith. They were deconstructing themselves out of their faith.
Mhm.
And for me, my faith in Jesus will always be the core center for me. So I couldn't lose that. But what I realized as others began this journey and I began reflecting on my own upbringing, that there were things that had been taught to me, whether explicitly or implicitly, about how to be a Christian or how to live your faith. And I was beginning to realize that a lot of those things didn't sit very comfortably with me. Either never really had or was becoming increasingly so. And a lot of that was intertwined with a lot of Western frameworks and ideologies. It was a certain American brand of Christianity, if you'd like, a bit more on the conservative evangelical end. That was my experience, with fundamentalist tinges, I would even say. And as I continued to grow in my faith, I was realizing that they didn't seem to align with what I'd been taught. So for me, decolonizing is a deconstructing, in a sense, of trying to disentangle my faith with those Western frameworks and ideologies that aren't helpful. Not all of it, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are a lot of things that I learned, and there are a lot of things that I have inherited, which I'm very proud to have received and been taught. But the unhelpful things, I had to let go. And the next step of the process, which we probably won't get into much this time around, but was to then, once I disentangled that, was to then embrace a bit more of my East Asian culture and heritage and try and reconcile that with my faith. And so going back again to what you said about how would I describe myself, I generally use the word East Asian because of my kind of overlap between Singapore and Japan. So I consider myself generally an East Asian Christian, who has been on this process of decolonizing unhelpful Western influences and reconciling it with my East Asian culture and heritage.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah, what was it? So, I mean, I think I've been on sort of some similar journey pathways as you have. Uh and that's why this topic is so interesting to me. I think a word that you used just now that another one that I like to put on that spectrum of near synonyms that I think is less, I think is helpful is disentangle.
Mm,
And I think, disentangling, like you mentioned, some of the Western preferences, especially as missionaries. I think even in the States, people can be challenged to make room for some of the theological ideas of their non-Western neighbors, as the West is really a melting pot. I was going to say becoming, but it's really has been for a long time. Maybe it's being recognized more these days. But yeah, something in the past that's come through my mind is just the idea of a status quo.
mm,
And in my own personal uh considering of what to disentangle and what not to, the idea of a status quo, what is the status quo? Is it my status quo because I was born in California in the 80s? And if you were born in California in the 80s and you're a Christian, you're a Protestant, you probably either something Calvary Chapel-esque
mm,
or John MacArthur-esque is
mm,
kind of, and that was really two or Rick Warren, and really
mm,
those three things were the probably three biggest influences of um my pre-college or college days, childhood through college. Um, and there's a lot of overlap, though there's internal debates between things and criticisms, but there's a lot of overlap theologically. And at one point, I was like, well, are those things the things that I should trust the most because I was born there, or because
mm.
they're historic Christian things? And looking back, looking back along history, you know, isn't I guess it's another way of being cross-cultural in a sense, that the historical church would look different on a lot of issues just because they're hundreds of years in the past. It's another way of taking distance from your own um theological home, I guess.
Mm.
That you may that and that was something that I think helped me once I was able to see the variety in history from where I came from. It became easy to see the variety geographically as well.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
yeah, yeah. So if I want to throw it back to you, can I ask you if you felt at some point there was some kind of a thing that triggered you to jump to kind of commit into the whole decolonization process, um, some kind of event or thing in your life or something like that?
Yeah, I was on a mission trip. I was doing an internship with my church here in the UK, and I was on a mission trip in Nantes in France. I was in my mid-20s at this time. We were walking around the cathedral, and I remember looking at the paintings, the Renaissance paintings of, Jesus and the disciples, and, beautiful classical paintings of biblical stories and figures. And I don't know what it was. I'm gonna put it down to the Holy Spirit kind of prompting me in that moment, or, just make awake, opening my eyes. But I realized Jesus wasn't white. Like, And you know what? I'm glad we've now, at least in my spheres, we've moved to a place where that's really obvious for a lot more people. But this was back in 2018. And for someone like myself who had grown up a Christian their whole life, it took me that long to realize the absurdity of of depicting Jesus as a white man. Like how I was trying to think in that moment, I was thinking, what would the disciples who were West Asian have thought about that? You know, would they have considered that heresy or whatever it is? Now I think there is a contextual thing of, different cultures depict Jesus differently. In Africa, Jesus is often the black man. In Asian countries, Jesus is, can be depicted as one of them. And the beauty of that is brings home the incarnational reality of Jesus was one of us, and therefore we can relate to him. But for so long, just because of my upbringing within that very American Western Christianity, whenever I prayed to Jesus, I always imagined and envisioned a white man. And it wasn't until I also took a missiology class that year, and the lecturer showed me an image of an East Asian Jesus. And I actually was moved to tears. Like I got quite emotional. And that was a completely unexpected response. One, because I didn't even know those depictions existed. But two, I didn't realize just how moving that was to me and how much closer to home it brought Jesus to me. And I would say that was one of the big turning points for me. And the other point as well was I was doing an essay for a historical theology class that same year. And my tutor, who was a Korean American, he introduced me to a theologian called Amos Yong, who is a Malaysian American Pentecostal theologian who is currently at Fuller Seminary. And he's absolutely brilliant. But he wrote a book called The Spirit Poured Out on All Flesh. And it was basically expounding how, because the Spirit poured out at Pentecost and subsequently on all people, men and women from all ethnic and cultural backgrounds, it was a very egalitarian, move of the Spirit, you could say. Like everyone received the Holy Spirit, no one was excluded. And one, I didn't realize there were Asian theologians. I'd grown up only learning and reading, if you think about the big Christian theologians slash influential teachers, you mentioned Rick Warren, Tim Keller, who else are there? John Piper,
Oh yeah.
you've got all these, and they have contributed amazing things, and I've learned a lot from those people. But again, that's my idea of who the theologians were and who shaped the discourse and the ideas around theology, which then naturally led to how do you apply it to living a life as a Christian. So when I found Amos Young, I was like, oh, someone who has a similar background to me, someone who grew up in East Asia, but now, was living in the West. But also what he was expounding was something that almost gave me permission to step into that. I don't know if authority is the right word, but just like, the Holy Spirit has been poured out into me. And yes, we work with tradition and the church and all of that, but I have my experience as well. And so how do I bring that into my formation of my faith journey? And so I would say those two, realizing that Jesus wasn't white and realizing that there were Asian theologians like Amos Young, were two really big turning points for me.
Yeah. Sorry. I mean, it's interesting because even just hearing you say that Jesus isn't white, and I think in my own background, going to like Bible schools that emphasized a lot of like historical kind of backgrounds, but really predominantly white schools.
Mhm.
I remember talking with a friend where this exact thing came up where we were trying to like street evangelize somewhere.
Mhm.
And he was talking with a black man, and we thought he was crazy. He was saying, Jesus is black,
Mhm.
and and we were like, of course Jesus isn't black, and of course Jesus isn't white. He's, Near
Mhm.
Eastern. And but in my mind at the time, and even really until now, it's kind of like, yes, he's not white, but he's not he's not something else enough. He's not white enough for me to feel like I can't identify with him as a person who's mostly white myself. But
Mhm.
hearing you say it, and I mean, I feel ridiculous because I now I'm in a position where I have a lot of friends who are not white, who are Christians, and the idea of a white Jesus or a non-white Jesus to me is kind of like, well, I can accept that because I'm not imagining a Jesus that looks so different from me. I
Mhm.
mean, I studied in Israel, and a lot of the people in Israel don't look so different from
Mhm.
white people. But then in my mind, just as you were talking, I was imagining like a Palestinian Jesus,
Mhm.
and a Palestinian Jesus doesn't look like me, even if
Mhm.
an Israeli Jesus looks like me. And I don't know if that's because there was so much, the people of Israel today had been in Europe for so long, for
Mhm.
generations. I don't know because I'm not an expert on that. But
Mhm.
it even just now opened my eyes that you, a person from East Asia, seeing a white Jesus and then coming to the realization that that's not really Jesus, and then me, a predominantly white person, seeing a white Jesus and saying, "Oh, that's not really Jesus." It has very little emotional impact on me, but most people in the world, it would. I'm just now. I mean, it would have such an emotional impact as you pointed out, which I think is interesting. And you mentioned Amos Young, so I'll take this opportunity just to give a little bit of my own sort of decolonization journey, and I'm going to keep it short. But part of the reason that led me to even start this podcast and really delve into the sort of Japanese theological context as I would think about it. Something else you mentioned earlier, we're trying not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Um, and as you were saying that, I was thinking that's exactly right. If Christianity is the baby and the sort of the context is the bathwater, or the Western context is the bathwater. Well, at the same time, you're right. We do want to throw out the bathwater so that we can put the baby in the bathwater of the people that we're trying to reach, I guess.
Mhm.
So if we want Japanese people to accept the baby, it's going to be easier for them to accept the baby if the baby's in ofuro, or whatever. I mean, it's a kind of
I
cheesy.
love that. I love that.
Well, thank you. I thought it was very cheesy, but I mean, just it made sense in my mind as I was saying it, and it's early in the morning for me, so I say things without thinking enough. But yeah, so you mentioned Amos Young, who I came into contact with as I was required to read one of his books in a seminary course I took about 2 years ago. And what I found, I was looking to get more into theological education. Again, I went to Bible college 20 years ago, got my BA, um, was pretty proud of that, I guess, and felt like, I was told signing up for missions again almost 20 years ago, um, that having a BA in biblical studies from a Christian or a Bible college is kind of fulfills the requirement for being a missionary, and is similar to the amount of education a lot of Japanese pastors would be getting. Um, Even though in the States you tend to go a little further. So I was pretty confident that I was, properly trained. Um, and then and then I guess some of the things that I saw just in American politics, um, and I don't want to be super divisive, but some of the things that I saw in American politics in the past in the past decade, we'll say, caused me to think more carefully. Like, I would like to study theology, Christianity, figure out where we are in this. And I say we, I mean my own background specifically. I guess sort of American evangelicalism or white American evangelicalism, and how that relates to what I do in Japan, and how we can reach Japan in a more away game mentality. So I'm a big baseball guy, so if you play for the Dodgers and you play in LA, the rules are pretty simple at Dodger Stadium. If you go to Chicago, you have to be careful because there's ivy on the home run fence and the rules change. So in Japan, I've always had that mentality, at least that we should be playing away game rules, and the home team is Japan in Japan for that. And that got me. I was listening to a podcast, the Jude 3 podcast, which is specifically to sort of empower the African American Christian community. And then I heard a man talking about a theology school to really to build up the African American community and scholarship. His thought was there are not as many Bible believing black scholars as he would have liked to have seen. You know, schools that tend to be heavily Bible believing tend to be historically sort of white and European, and without realizing it, haven't decontextualized, disentangled some of the harmful things that have come from the past, and end up being fairly uncomfortable for black students if we're to just listen to the words of some of the people that have gone to some of the black students that have gone to some of these institutions. So he started a online, like a seminary, to try and really grow I think grow the pool of black Bible believing scholars. And I heard that and I was like, if something like this happened for Japan, like a community where Japanese theology is really prioritized, that'd be so cool. So I like immediately applied, right? And then nobody got back to me for months, and I was like, oh, I just realized I'm white, and this is a school that's totally for for the black community. I'm like, I'm way out of their mission statement. And it was just the thing was just that there wasn't a lot of administrative help at the time, so it took them time to get back to me. And so I've been able to study there. And my point in doing that was I'd like to see how things are both decontextualized and then contextualized. What are the things that should be decontextualized? And one of the first books I read was one of Amos Young's book. So that's where I wanted to get back to you there. And so, you mentioned just the idea of reading theologians from other parts of the world, or other ethnicities and nationalities and perspectives. I didn't know that some of the really great missiologists, that are working today are actually, from Africa. I'm not sure if I'm going to say his name correctly, but Lamin Sana is a big missiologist that you can, people can read his stuff. Kwame Bediako has some great stuff. And it makes me just wonder, people say that the continent that's growing Christianity the fastest and by 2050 looks to be really a world leader in Christianity should be Africa. And it's funny because the type of Christianity that seems to be growing outside of the West, Pentecostal Christianity, is one that, again, that I don't have a great understanding of. I think the Western Church doesn't have a great understanding of. But as you mentioned, I think there's some good things that we can learn from it, and just seeing, stuff from African theologians and self-studying a lot of what I can get my hands on in from Japanese theologians has helped me to see God from angles that I hadn't in the past. So that was just personally, I mean, if I was going to encourage the listener to think about decolonizing, you get a great view of God, from vantage points that you hadn't naturally looked at. So I think that's pretty cool. Um, Justin, so you mentioned, your de how you started decontextualizing and some people that influenced that. Um, so like where does that leave you now, and where do you see yourself going? And how would you recommend people who want to be open to, I mean, I feel like you have to decolonize to be open to to find that fresh context. So how would you tell people how they can go about this?
It's a really good question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that, so that's quite exciting. I think what I want to begin by saying is kind of picking up on what you said about decontextualizing, and then I don't know if you said recontextualizing, but you said contextualizing in the Japanese context, for example. And I want to reiterate, because I don't think it can be said enough, especially with a lot of people going through deconstruction phases, that deconstruction, at least for me, is never the end goal. It's reconstruction. It's not recolonization. Just to say that. A lot of post-colonial studies is always about how do you, when the Western colonial powers came, it was very much, okay, how do you get rid of those influences? But when you get rid of that, you're left adrift. And what you need to do is then figure out, okay, what is your national identity, or what do what are you then bringing to the table? And so for me, the initial decontextualizing, deconstruction, whatever phrase you want to use, I'm using them a bit more overlap, that I shared, especially in this podcast, is only the start. It was the people like Amos Young, those moments with the more personal, emotive moment with the white Jesus incident. Those were the things that alerted me to the fact that there was more to discover. But I wasn't content to then just to stay there. I was like, okay, I want to discover more of who God is. I want to discover more of who God has created me to be, with my context, with my background, culturally, ethnically, which is beautiful, just as like everyone's ethnic cultural backgrounds is beautiful. And so I've been on a massive journey of reading a lot of East Asian theologies, especially, that come from Christians who are wrestling with this same question, who are wrestling with the same questions as I am in interreligious contexts. In Japan, because Christianity is a minority religion, you've got Shintoism and Buddhism and, and animism and all of that. And how do you, navigate your way as a Christian in those contexts? And there are other East Asian countries, or even other Asian countries like Singapore. It's multicultural, multi-ethnic. How do you wrestle with that when when they're multicultural and multi-ethnic places? And I think what I would say to someone who is open to learning is, the more perspectives you get on being a Christian from different people, the easier it is to broaden your understanding. Because at the end of the day, everything is predicated on relationships. You know, we can talk abstract theory as long as we want. But if we don't actually create relationships with people and learn their stories and learn how it affects them, then it's just words on the page. It's not, it doesn't bring it home. Now, the great thing about books is that it allows you exposure to different people from around the world that maybe you wouldn't necessarily have in your immediate sphere of friends or acquaintances. So I would 100% recommend getting exposed to as many theologies from people who are genuine Christians. And most of the time, people who are doing this deep theological work are genuine Christians because they are wrestling. If they care about it so much that they're wrestling with it, that's saying something. If you really didn't care, you wouldn't bother.
Yeah.
But I would also say within your spheres, get to know people, listen to the Japanese Christian, ask them, what do you think about this? Have you ever thought about that? Because the more you hear, the more you listen, the more you realize, wow, my view of things is not necessarily wrong, but it can be quite myopic. It can be quite narrow, and it doesn't have the full breadth of diverse perspectives of who God is. And, as Christians, if we're seeking to love God and worship God more, both deeper and broader, then I want to learn how you, Jonathan, worship God. I want to learn how you engage with God, what God's revealed himself to you, so that I can maybe, pick that out and incorporate it into my own worship life and my faith. Because that might be a blind spot of mine. I want to know from, that sister or that brother. I want to learn more about it. So I think the first step to anything is coming with that attitude of humility and teachability, the awareness that, I'm sorry to say, you don't know everything.
Yeah. No, I think I want to just jump in because I think that probably myself historically included, one of the biggest obstacles for, I'll just keep it in context for myself and say Western
Mhm.
Christians, is the good theology concept. Like, it's easy, and I think we need to be challenged to move away from this to a degree. It's easy to say, I have good theology, therefore if there's something that I disagree with, that's bad theology, and it's either or. And
Yes.
I think, yeah, it's either or when you get up into Nicaea, and the Apostles' Creed and the Trinity and things like that. Sure. But when you get into secondary issues or just the ways that you see, you know, the ways that you see God, I think there's a lot more room for plurality.
Yes.
And having that attitude that I can learn something, and that if someone doesn't agree with me perfectly, it doesn't make either of us heterodox. It doesn't make either of us have bad theology. I think, in a sense, one thing that I've been challenging myself with, and I don't even know if it's really true, but I've come to the point now where I don't think there is um any theologian that I know that I've been able to say I agree with this person 100%. And that
Mhm.
includes my friends, my family. If you agree with one person 100%, then I think that it's worth asking yourself, if you're sort of hunting a bit, if the words are bad, but like makaseru, if you're letting that person take care of you
Mhm.
theologically to the point where you're not, and I was doing that when I came to Japan. I would say, well, I was trained at the master's college, so if I don't know the answer, I'll look in the MacArthur Study Bible, and I'll just agree with that. That works for me. And I'm not trying to say this now to push anyone or condemn anyone that does that, because that's where I was. but I felt like once I made the jump and I said, I want to I want to be responsible for my own theological understanding. That also gave me, I think, the opportunity to really listen to people on things and to also hold things lightly enough that I could appreciate things, even things that I don't 100% agree with on secondary or tertiary
Mm.
issues. And it really has me feeling more like seeing like a kaleidoscope of theology and the beauty in that, rather than saying, is this point correct? And if this point is correct, then these other points are incorrect. Therefore, they're not worth anything. So I think
Mm.
having that openness um, is a great way to be able to decolonize, I guess, and to see different contexts, especially if you serve in a secondary context. I'm sorry, I kind of jumped over you a bit.
Oh, that's
Um,
okay.
yeah, I don't know. I think I mean, we can go on and on with this one. But if you have any sort of final words on this topic, I think just time-wise, that's a good place to finish. And it'd be great to talk again about some of the other things that or you can also share your Substack.
Hmm.
I think that'd also be a great place for people who are thinking about how to be more of a broadly
Yeah.
thinking Christian. So if you want to share any of that.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think the final thing I want to say is finishing the answer to your question of where am I at now on this journey. So if the initial stage was kind of, okay, these Western influences aren't the best. Okay, these Asian theologies, wow, I didn't realize there was a whole way of doing things. I'm learning more so that I can understand myself more and who God's created me to be. I am currently in a third step, you could say, of, okay, as an East Asian Christian with my cultural and ethnic background and influences, how can I then now help impact the Western church? So it's kind of like bringing bringing it back, and not being ashamed of who I am, or not just being a Christian in the white Western way that I was raised, but now being like, actually, this is what I bring to the table. This is what I have to teach you. And that's not in a condescending or proud way. It's just look, you've taught me, the West has taught me so much, which I still value to this day and I still live out. But there's a lot more about the Christian faith and life that can be discovered and learned. And this is what I can bring to the table. And actually, the dissertation that I did for my MA in theology at Cranmer was what the Western Church can learn from East Asian theologies, particularly in relation to an openness to the spirit world. And that kind of
Wow.
ties back to what you said about how, generalizing again, but other than kind of more charismatic Pentecostal spheres, the Western world, post-Enlightenment, very rationalism influenced, has, you could say, more so than not dispensed with the spirit realm, you know.
Sure. Sure.
And
Yeah.
whereas the majority world, the global South, Latin America, Africa, Asia, the spirit world is part and parcel of life.
Yeah.
And that is closer to the biblical world. We believe in
Absolutely.
the Holy Spirit. The Holy
Right.
Spirit, God,
Right.
Spirit, So that was very much so because my current present context is in the UK, is in the West, as much as I love the Asian theologies and as much as I'm still wrestling with, okay, what does it mean for Japanese contextual faith, which I think it's brilliant you're doing this. Because my present context is in the West, I'm now being like, okay, what does contextual faith in Japan look like? How can that benefit the church in the West? How can we be a global church together? So if you'd like to learn more, hopefully, we can have more conversations, Jonathan. But if you would like to read more of my journey, I have a Substack, which is a newsletter. It's free. It's called Decolonizing My Faith. Decolonizing with an S because I am in the UK, not America. So decolonizing with an S, myfaith.substack.com. And I started this a year ago, and it's basically just me sharing personally my journey, ongoing journey of what I've shared about briefly today. Like I said, it's free. You just sign up by putting your email, and it will send it to your inbox every time I write a post. If you would like to support me, then you can become a paid subscriber. I'm not doing it for the money at all, but it's been really encouraging over the past year with the number of people who have said, thank you for writing this, because that's actually helped me. Maybe you might be a Westerner who is wanting to be open and learn more about global theologies, and especially Asian theologies. Maybe you are an East Asian, who are on the same journey as I am and wanting to learn more about what it means to be an East Asian Christian. So hopefully there is something you can have a look, and please do subscribe if you would like.
Great. Well, thank you for taking the time to share about your life and this journey that you've been on, and I hope can be something that spurs a lot of people on to think in ways that broadens the way we think about God and makes us more generous in the way that we think about each other. Because we have a lot not only to give, but really to receive from others in the church. And I think that's one of the things that anybody, missionary or not, can be excited about with the global church. So thanks again, and I'll just go ahead and stop recording. So thanks for tuning in, everyone, and see you next time.